Welcome, friends. It's so good to see all of you here this evening. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue. I know many of you, but not all of you, and so please let me welcome everybody to this kickoff to Pride Month here at Central. We have a lot of great Pride programming coming up, including a talk next Wednesday by Evan Wolfson, really the architect of the marriage equality movement. There will be a happy hour right before that program and then the program itself, and I hope many of you will consider coming back and joining us then. We are also going to be marching in the Pride Parade as a central delegation. That's the last Sunday in June. If you're interested in joining us, please hop onto our website, click on the Pride Month events, and register to join us. Tonight, our very exciting, very special kickoff to Pride Month is, in fact, the program I was most looking forward to all year. Dr. Golan Moskowitz, our guest speaker this evening, is Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Tulane University. He's a literary scholar, a cultural historian, and a visual artist. He did his graduate work at Brandeis University, where he got a PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and Women and Gender Studies. He also has he had a joint MA in Jewish Studies and Women's and Gender Studies, in addition to the PhD. His BA comes from Vassar College, upstate. He applies visual studies and creative modes of inquiry to his scholarship and to his teaching, as well as to his talk with us this evening. Dr. Moskowitz's most recent book is about the wild visionary Maurice Sendak, looking at this incredible genius, storyteller, illustrator in context with his queer and Jewish identities. Golan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman. It's really a pleasure to be here at Central Synagogue. I've been following you from New Orleans, where I'm based, your sermons online. It's been a beautiful experience. And I want to thank my friend George Dansker, who actually introduced me to Central. He had been watching the live streams and really loving them. So happy Pride. Good to be with you all today. So today my talk, again, is the basis. It's based on my book, Maurice Sendak in Queer Jewish Context, is the subtitle, Wild Visionary, published in 2020 by Stanford University Press. And it studies how Sendak's creative output relates directly to his internalized concerns related to Jewish American history, to LGBTQ studies, Holocaust memory, and the history of modern childhood. My book does this by mobilizing a historically contextualized account of the artist's life and work to advance and generate new dimensions of cultural theory, or at least I hope it does. And ultimately, it argues that Sendak's particular experience of Jewishness, of queerness, and of their intersections directly impacted his creative contributions to literary and emotional shifts in American children's literature in the mid-20th century, and that it offered new mirrors of resilience, not only for children, but also for other marginal individuals accustomed to misrecognition, to creative shape-shifting, and to the employment of fantasy for survival. In the present talk, I'm going to attempt to demonstrate how Sendak's creative vision, his sensibilities, convey the historically specific position of a queer American child of Yiddish-speaking immigrants impacted by the economic depression and by Holocaust losses. And to do so, I'll offer an overview of Sendak's upbringing, followed by close readings of his writing and creative works, rooting the analysis in cultural histories of Jewish Brooklyn, American childhood, Holocaust memory, and queer identity. And I think we'll have a Q&A at the end of the lecture for a few minutes, so keep questions in mind. I'm also going to discuss how my book employs theory from trauma and memory studies that describes the impulses towards self-evacuation and creative investments in the past that I read into Sendak's work through queer and Jewish lenses. And beyond demonstrating the impact of queerness and Jewish culture and history on Sendak's creative vision, I'm also striving to illustrate how Sendak channeled these marginal sensibilities and emotional rhythms into creative battlegrounds, as he called them, for challenging wider American conceptions of childhood. So as most of us know, when Maurice Sendak passed away in 2012, a little over a decade ago, he did so as a cultural legend. And what drove his success, really, was his ability to recall, humanize, and formally exalt emotional qualities of childhood, including childhood's unpleasant, awkward, and painful aspects. He pierced through some of the rose-colored cliches about a childhood simplicity. And of course, we know that childhood is not a singular concept, but it varies across contexts. So let's think, what sort of specific childhood did Sendak himself experience? What childhood informed his creative vision most directly? Some of you might have already read that Sendak's lower middle class Brooklyn youth spanned the Depression and World War II in a family of Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants, and that his parents each immigrated alone to New York as teenagers around the years of World War I. Sendak claims that he internalized the fragility of his existence as a sickly Brooklyn infant before the era of penicillin, whose immigrant parents fretted openly about the possibility of him dying, and then raised him during the Great Depression. Accordingly, his work focused on a single question that obsessed him, as he put it, the question, how do children survive? In his own words, his art repeatedly asked, how do you prevent dying? How do you prevent being eaten or mauled by a monster? His caretakers had conveyed historically based anxieties to him at an early age, warning him that Jews could be targeted with violence and that children can sometimes lose their parents or even die unprotected. Families like Sendak's held tight to their children and imbued them with values of resilience and survivalism. They stressed the importance of political consciousness and in-group loyalty, even as they pushed their children to achieve American success. And his home was an atmosphere of emotionally fraught insecurity and close-knit family bonds. His mother, Sadie, and his maternal grandmother, Mili, recalled memories in which Cossacks would ransack Mini's grocery store, and Mini would need to push Sadie, her daughter, Sendak's mother, into the cellar to hide. By age 4, Sendak started to have recurring nightmares about these scenes. Despite his sensitivity to some of these frightening recollections, he considered one of the highlights of his childhood to be the violent, fantastical stories that were told to him by his father at bedtime. Likely drawing from his father's experience of cheder in Poland, in the town of Zembrowa, and from the midrashic tales that his father Philip was exposed to there, Philip embellished otherwise truthful renderings in these stories, renderings of his youth, with elements of fantasy, biblical archetypes, and local ghost stories that he had grown up with. And these cliffhanger bedtime stories that Sendak grew up with often extended over multiple nights and included the terror of Cossacks and Polish peasants who wielded clubs studded with nails. They also featured children who get lost, fall asleep in the snow, struggle to get their parents to recognize them after periods of separation. And one example, to give you a taste of these stories, is a story about a child who loses his way in the winter, finds himself under a tree, and sobs until he falls asleep and passes away in the cold. The souls of the biblical Abraham and Sarah usher him to heaven. In another of Philip's tales at bedtime, a boy named David finds his lost parents among a hunter's horde of kidnapped prisoners, and despite his urge to reconnect with his parents, pretends not to recognize them, so that the hunter will not suspect him of trying to free them. Philip's stories would blend in Sendak's imagination with fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. And I think we can see kind of the crossover here of how the use of metaphor, repetition, and hyperbole offer wild and poignant truths and warnings, even to children, both in stories like Philip's and in the Grimm tales. Sendak would later illustrate a volume of Brothers Grimm tales, and he would also illustrate a collection called In Grandpa's House, which you see images from on screen in 1985, based on Yiddish tales of his father that were dictated to him ultimately as his father was passing away in the 80s, or rather in the 70s earlier, later translated. The Sendaks were not alone in narrating dark or upsetting situations to their children. Reflecting generations of oral storytelling in Jewish Poland, bedtime stories in many Yiddish-speaking immigrant families, like Sendak's, reflect the need to nourish the child's capacity to locate and heed dangerous situations. And this also is reflected in Yiddish children's literature published in interwar Europe and the US, which handled difficult themes of war, violence, mortality, racism, and lynching. Yiddish children's literature of the 1930s, like Philip's bedtime stories, reflected the harsh realities that endangered minorities were facing, as well as the political terror of what it meant to live under oppressive political regimes. If Sadie and Philip were burdening their children or exposing them to harsh realities, Sendak actually understood their emotional transparency with their children, himself included, as more respectful of their children's human capacities than a stance of concealment or condescension would have been. What might have struck outsiders as an immigrant parent's lack of social refinement by public standards, for Sendak was actually a means of trust building and emotional connection against the restraint and mannered calculation popular in mainstream parenting ideals of the time. As Sendak once mused, and I'm quoting him here, "My parents were immigrants, and they did not know that they should clean their stories up for us. So we heard horrible, horrible stories. And we loved them. We absolutely loved them." Sendak repeating details of these stories would get sent home from school to have his mouth washed out with soap more than once. While parent-child relationships in families like Sendak's might have challenged middle-class social laws of propriety, they also were eliciting strong emotional bonds and inspiring wild fantasies in the service of humor and truth-seeking within a family that was socially othered. Beyond his immediate family, the artist's more distant greenhorn relatives, as he would later refer to them, were some of the most frightening and inspiring figures in his childhood. And he would famously recall a typical Sunday afternoon in Brooklyn in the late 1930s, in which his Polish refugee relatives would come over and devour much of his mother Sadie's cooking. As a child whose cheeks they were pinching, Sendak almost feared that they were going to eat him as well. These relatives, he repeatedly claimed later, would serve as the primary inspiration for his Wild Things, who later entreat Max with their haunting plea, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." Like the Wild Things, Sendak recalled his relatives as, quote, "a huge bunch who would roughly snatch you up at any moment. They'd jabber loudly in a foreign tongue, kiss, pinch, maul, and hug you breathless, all in the name of love. Their dread faces loomed, flushed, jagged teeth flaring, eyes inflamed, and great nose hairs cascading." He has a very descriptive mind. "All oddly smelly and breathy, all dangerous, all growling, but also all relatives and all human," right? You see the human feet that poke out beneath these wild creatures, some of them. Right, so there's I think something being negotiated about boundaries and about closeness, but also fear around these relatives. If Sendak saw these relatives as dangerous or wild, he also venerated his older relatives. He consistently applauded the family's emotional style, again, for offering a dynamic of informality and frankness and honesty, an affectionate solidarity between parents and children, despite American individualist ideals that discouraged deep emotional intertwinement across generations. This cultural difference is recorded in simple and profound terms by another Jewish American figure, Eva Hoffman, who actually immigrated from Poland to North America, to Canada, after her parents survived the Holocaust in hiding. And she wrote, "Familial bonds seem so dangerously loose here," right, compared to Eastern European Jewish familial bonds. Against a backdrop of assimilation pressures that derided Yiddish speakers and encouraged immigrant children to really separate from their parents in a lot of ways, to assert themselves as distinct American individuals, to not speak Yiddish, to function in the public sphere as Americans, Sendak internalized culturally fraught separation anxieties with his immigrant parents. And these, I argue, color some of his later depictions of children who must fend for themselves beyond their parents' protection, and also depictions of grown-ups who become hovering moons or wild creatures that are both endearing and repelling at the same time to their child protagonists. Beyond matters of American acculturation, the close-knit Sendak family unit experienced even greater distress by the 1940s as real-life horror stories were penetrating their Brooklyn home. Jewish relatives, as we know, were being deported and murdered overseas, and Sadie and Philip continuously received word of Jewish deaths in Europe by way of Jewish American agencies and Philip's social club. Sadie would yell and pull at her hair. Philip would sometimes disappear and collapse. In their apartment, they displayed photographs of nieces and nephews who were sent to concentration camps, and these included newlyweds and infants. And these images were all that Sendak really knew of most of his extended family. It was suffocating, unhappy, he would later write. Almost like my father was blaming me for being alive. Dead Jews hung all over the place, these photographs. Sadie and Philip constantly contrasted their youngest son's irreverent childhood energies, Maurice, with the idealized young relatives of those children who were being killed abroad, children whom they mourned and whom he would never know. If he complained or misbehaved, his parents were quick to call him a wilde chaya, or a wild beast, wild creature, wild thing, shaming him for taking his privileges in America for granted, privileges denied to those cousins overseas who were starving in camps. And as he would later write, if I was staying out late and dinner was on the table and I'd been called 3 times, my mother's voice would tell me that I'd better go up now, and she'd say, your cousins, they're in a concentration camp. You have the privilege of being here, and you don't come up and eat. They have no food. I was made to feel guilty all the time that I was shamelessly enjoying myself when they were being cooked in an oven. So another dimension of this wildness associated with a kind of guilt as someone growing up in the safety of America during this time. Sendak despised these reminders of his own vulnerability as a Jew, even in America. And I think it's clear that their household, the Sendak's household in Brooklyn, and its proximity to migration and collective trauma, colored the tone of this household and separated it from other American homes, including some other American Jewish homes. But again, Philip and Sadie were not unique. They're not unusual among other Yiddish-speaking Jews in their impulses to expose their children during this time to historical horrors, even those as stark as the genocide occurring in Europe at the time. Contrary to narratives that assert a universal silence in the years of the Holocaust and the immediate aftermath, Yiddish schools and periodicals were discussing these events almost immediately, beginning in 1938 with Kristallnacht. Children's journals like the Kinderjournal in Yiddish detailed accounts of ghettos, gassing, and other atrocities committed against Jews in Poland. Yiddish writers even made appeals to Jewish children directly. There's, for example, a front-page story in one Yiddish children's journal about hundreds of homeless Jewish children, refugees who've made it to America and who cannot muster a smile for the photograph because their hearts are weighted with grief. The article also describes invasions of Jews' homes by stormtroopers at night, masses of Jews forced in starvation, in panic, into death and concentration camps. The systemic murder of Jewish relatives in Europe during World War II surely complicated American Jewish parents' expectations of their own children, I think as we have started to see in the Sendak household as well. In their Bensonhurst neighborhood, the Orthodox congregation Sons of Israel really was emphasizing the role of Jewish children for the rebirth and destiny of post-war American Jewry, reminding, for example, in their 1947 yearbook, reminding their congregants that the cherubim were said to resemble children, right? And that the role of youth was a central role in guarding and transmitting Jewish tradition to future generations. Often, however, post-war American Jewish children were reminding their parents of those relatives and friends who did not live to know them and who could never be sufficiently replaced. Often those born after the war were named after those relatives. Comparisons and associations made between Jewish children and lost relatives were understandably burdensome at times for those children. And some parents were paradoxically demanding that their post-war offspring would both preserve the painful history of their family while also becoming exceptionally successful, carefree, and American to compensate for Hitler's atrocities and for their family's losses. So speaking for himself and his siblings, Sendak along these lines would later lament, "We didn't know who we were," his sister, his brother, and himself, "and whatever we chose to be was seemingly in opposition to what our parents wanted us to be." Although the Sendak's household did not experience Nazi terror directly, they may be said to have undergone a kind of secondhand trauma, as they learned in real time about their family's decimation abroad and struggled to make sense of the implications in the present. And so this is where I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the theoretical underpinning of how I deal with trauma and memory in my book. So bear with me if you're not a trauma person or not a theory person. I look at how literary theorist Kathy Carruth describes trauma as what she calls an unclaimed experience in this study. What she means by that is an internalization. Trauma as an internalization that is both too painful and chaotic for consciousness to fully claim, but also too eventful and too penetrating to discard altogether. In other words, trauma is a kind of foreign object inside of you, a phenomenon that you've undergone, that you've experienced, but too chaotic, too world-shattering, too world-shaking to fully understand, to have your mind cognitively wrap itself around. And therefore, it was experienced, but it's an unclaimed experience. And so this kind of experience, of an unclaimed experience, can produce internal disorganization, specifically around a sense of time. Timelessness is sometimes discussed as an impact of trauma, a sense of timelessness, specifically around the era of the trauma itself. And it can compel the traumatized person or subject to search, to collect data, to externalize emotionally, right, to try to master or resolve those internal conflicts. And in the case of Sendak, who invested intensely in the memory of his murdered relatives in the Holocaust and the news of their deaths during his adolescence, his formative years, these events represented a complicated and overwhelming matrix of violent meanings, again, a kind of secondhand trauma. And the deaths of these relatives signified lost connections to spaces of ethnic belonging and also the resulting incapacitation, as I mentioned, of his own parents on whom he depended for survival, and an internalized belief that people like him were not safe in the world. His father, Philip, even directly assured him the Holocaust could happen in America and warned him he should keep a suitcase packed in the closet just in case. As an anxious, introspective outsider who struggled to make friends and fixated on the forms of endangerment that he was internalizing, he would later claim, as you see on screen here, "I skipped my adolescence, total amnesia." And I think this perceived displacement of a skipped adolescence situates him within the realm of Kathy Carruth's theory of trauma as a kind of unclaimed experience, something the mind can't quite wrap itself around cognitively. Similar to Carruth's theory, Mariana Hirsch's theory of post-memory refers to what it means to grow up intertwined with a parent's overwhelmingly meaningful but also inaccessible experience of endangerment and loss. In this case, the parent's unresolved and all-pervasive psychology as it manifests in behavior and relational styles leads post-memorial children to feel haunted or threatened by a past, but a past that they did not themselves experience, right, their parents' past, as well as compelled to try to piece that past together, to relate to it through creative investment in the parents' traumatic history. So I think this illustrates a kind of secondhand, even more secondhand relationship to a traumatic past, and an impulse, again, to work through that past, to try to find some understanding or relationship to it, because it is defining in some way. My study demonstrates the interrelatedness between post-memory with Agnieszka Bedingfield's concept of transmemory, another kind of figurative recall. And in transmemory, there's a focus not necessarily on trauma always, but on the difficulty of cultural and linguistic adjustment from the language and memory of parents' origins to the language and culture of a new adopted home country. So transmemory relates in a lot of ways more to experiences of immigration. According to Bedingfield, the subject's stability can be threatened by the inability to narrate the past in a language that is meaningful to the present. And I think this surely characterized Sendak's experience as a Yiddish-speaking household, in a wider context that was pressuring assimilation, and decades before the emergence of mainstream Holocaust memory in Anglophone culture. So people weren't really talking about the Holocaust the way in later decades. By the 60s and 70s, conversations are starting to emerge, making the events themselves even more incoherent cognitively, culturally. As Bedingfield writes, subjects of transmemory have an impulse to return to the imagined spaces of an uneasy heritage that overshadows them and defines them on some level in order to find closure with unresolved internal conflicts they're experiencing in the present. This idea that maybe somehow in the world of the parents' past that is inaccessible to the individual experiencing transmemory, there's some key to resolving the self or the conflicts of the self in the present. And I think Sendak's work gives shape to past-oriented familial longings like these, and to the frustrations and impotence of the secondhand nature of those longings, right? These are not his experiences, not his past, neither the Holocaust experiences nor the childhoods of his parents in Poland. Yet they're so defining and important to him, and he relates them to his own conflicts as a subject struggling to grow up in America. While Hirsch and Bedingfield illuminate how a parent's history might displace a child's own narrative, queer theory understands the capacity of wider dominant cultural ideas to occupy and suppress a child's experience, so another layer of complication. The queer child, for example, is displaced by the overarching norms and expectations of a prevailing social structure that condemns the child's emerging identity or emerging desires as impossible or unwelcome. Catherine Bond Stockton paints queer childhood as a time of ghostly self-evacuation under the prohibition of claiming one's own stigmatized internal reality, at least until adulthood. And I think it's still often true, but even more so in the 20th century, that adults are allowed to say, I was a queer child, I knew I was queer as a child, but wasn't allowed to tell people or was not accepted as such. I was told, wait till you're older, et cetera, et cetera. And so Sendak fought to embody and assert his own feelings and sense of self against an overwhelming set of adult-imposed obstacles, both in terms of his queerness and his relationship to his parents' pasts. He felt like the changeling ice baby that he would depict in Outside Over There later, switched and replaced by some false version of himself to which his mother had no awareness. And he repeatedly described this baby, this ice baby that's left in the wake of this young child's kidnapping as himself as an infant. That he felt his mother didn't fully understand him and never could. His parents couldn't fully see him, and others couldn't see him as he was growing up. And interestingly, he makes this a female infant, right, in the story. The artist would base Outside Over There on what he called the hell of growing up without knowing who to talk to, who to trust, and how to function. He described his own childhood exclusion in the wider culture from dominant channels of meaning-making as a queer subject, as someone culturally marginal, and the consequent difficulty of coming into himself and his own feelings as a coherent subject. To understand how individuals cope with these kinds of struggles and how they survive, Stockton, the same theorist, has a theory called growing sideways, a proposition that queer or displaced subjects or children who cannot authentically grow upward or forward by conventional standards instead grow outward, that they project themselves into uncharted, sometimes hidden spaces of culture and society perceived as incoherent, wild, or avant-garde. And a central thread in my book looks at how the queerness of Sendak's displacement as he depicted it involves these children kind of floating in liminal spaces, that they are often flying freely, flying outward, flying backwards in some cases, as Ida does in this story, and that this queerness and displacement is intertwined with the lost worlds of Sendak's parents' Poland and the vicarious Holocaust terror that his family experienced from a distance as their relatives were being murdered. He sort of places these rhythms in dialogue with each other to work through his own subjectivity and its complications. So I'm going to zoom out for a bit and talk a little bit more about Sendak's contributions to children's literature in the moment that he became kind of a figure in children's literature in the 50s. And broadly speaking, his picture books were intervening in 20th century culture by responding to a theoretical figure referred to as the generic child that emerged in America's cultural imagination between about 1900 and 1960, according to historian Nicholas Salmond. And as a cultural symbol, this generic child that Sendak was kind of subverting in his work was a figure that represented ideals that parents were pursuing as they were raising their children during these decades. A figure that represented images mobilized by marketers of the growing child markets, childhood products at the time to inspire sales, and also an ideal figure to represent the embodiment and vulnerable innocence used by critics condemning certain aspects of the American public. So, for example, the use of the political terminology of protecting the children by excluding certain figures from the public sphere, right? Remembering that, for example, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder and criminalized until the 1970s, right? And how that was placed in dialogue with the need to protect the children, right? Think to the 1970s and the debates around children teaching in the public schools. I actually found an essay. It was an assignment from when my father was in high school or something, and you were asked to take a stand on whether gay people should be allowed to teach in public schools. I was very proud of him that he said they should be, but he didn't know he'd have a gay son in the future. But so this child symbol of the generic child figure was conceived as an obedient, physically restrained, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant child with uncomplicated emotions, who was epitomized by the Dick and Jane figures in the readers published from 1930 to 65 on screen. And populations seeking entry into the middle class during these years were often eager to obey the prescriptions of this generic child ideal, which operated as a cultural site of debate for who warranted inclusion in the nation's future and under which conditions, and especially in the post-war years, right? Think 1945 and later after World War II, the nation is really rebuilding itself, and childhood and the future of the nation is a big focus. Children's literature about ethnic minorities in the immediate post-war years helped integrate images of conditionally white ethnic families, including most Jewish, Irish, and Italian Americans, into an idea of normal, lighthearted, decorous, and thoroughly American children, right? So through images of childhood. We can see one example in the world of Yiddish-speaking Jews, a representation here from the Kinderjournal's cover, how it revamped its cover art by the 1940s with a more childish aesthetic. And so this reflects how American Jews' emotional shifts were taking place towards suburban middle-class belonging and optimism at mid-century. And this is the same time that American Jewry is emerging as kind of the leading Jewish population in the world after the war. And the Kinderjournal's artwork, right, you can see the shift, right, from ornamental patterns of majestic animals, flowers, etc., into images of wide-eyed, cartoonish children dressed in sailor outfits and other costumes, baseball bats, dolls, playful cartoon animals, so again reflecting childhood markets that are growing and this generic childhood ideal. A young Sendak at the time also participates in his own small way in this larger effort, illustrating a couple of picture books released by organizations like the United Synagogue Commission on Jewish Education, which published simple stories in English about Jewish holidays, Shabbat, Hanukkah, and also the Anti-Defamation League. He contributes to this publication, Seven Little Stories, which was working to advocate against social prejudice among youth. And I kind of argue in my book that he offers a sort of queer and ethnically specific spin to his depictions. But the picture books to offer the greatest optimism about Jewish integration into the American mainstream in the post-war years were not really Sendak's work for the ADL or United Synagogue Commission. They were really Sidney Taylor's All of a Kind Family, which began in 1951, some of you might be familiar with. And this was the first children's book series about Jews to attract a large non-Jewish readership, which I think speaks to the way that these children were represented, the universal appeal that they held for all American children. So during this cultural moment, children's literature, which was previously marginal in American publishing, in a larger sense, was exploding in these post-war decades as a profitable beacon of middle-class American idealism. And the post-war baby boom and its accompanied rise in funding for public schools and libraries created a thriving market that prompted publishers to expand their lists and empowered librarians, children's librarians, editors, and critics to rise to influence, awarding the Newbery and Caldecott prestigious medals. However, despite these advances, children's literature in the 1950s was still kind of a marginal field when you look at the broader fields of publishing and visual art. And counterintuitively, that's part of why Sendak entered the field of children's picture books. He entered the field, as he would describe it, because in children's picture books, artists could create their most genuine and heartfelt works off the map, so to speak, relatively unseen by cultural authorities. In a 2004 interview, for example, he reflected on his career with the following words: "I did not have much confidence in myself, never. And so I hid inside this modest form called the children's book and expressed myself entirely. I'm like a guerrilla warfarer in my best books." So subverting or avoiding this generic child ideal, Sendak's depictions in his books were drawing directly from the emotional underbelly of Jewish Brooklyn, as well as from his own experiences of secondhand memory of Polish Jewish life and the impact of Holocaust losses. His work was championing a more complex vision of children's capacities and claiming ground for marginal American subjects in a broader sense. And unlike those Dick and Jane readers or Sidney Taylor characters whose emotional styles and behaviors were virtually indistinguishable from the broader ideals of the Gentile middle class, Sendak's ethnically distinct urban children did not always behave politely or nicely or innocently, and did not always remain within the confines of a protected domestic sphere in the suburbs. Like immigrants or other minority subjects, they were grappling in his books with deep-seated, often invisible dilemmas and emotional crises, and sometimes acting out against the struggles they faced. And they navigated cultural gaps between home and the public sphere, as well as between personal orientations and the social pressures of post-war America. Throughout his career, Sendak would invite both controversy and admiration for his radical departure from this generic child ideal, really setting a precedent for this, challenging American children's book conventions of depicting normative children in emotionally subdued, rose-colored suburban worlds. And his rebellious, ethnic-looking children were among the first in children's literature to exhibit rage and emotional excess, as well as to demand love. In fact, his Harper editor Ursula Nordstrom called Where the Wild Things Are the first picture book to recognize the fact that children have powerful emotions, anger and love and hate, and only after all that passion, the wanting to be where someone loved them best of all. Right? If you're unfamiliar, Where the Wild Things Are ends with Max longing to return home where someone loved him best of all. Even though he's fighting with his mother, the wild things kind of get a little too wild for him and he wants to return home. But it's not until after he's let out that rage and engaged in that rumpus, right, that this is an important part of the child's experience first to experience. And so, I want to stress the wildness, the unusual aspects or emotionally frustrated aspects of the children that he was depicting draw not only from their ethnic difference, but also from their potential queerness, particularly their atypical relationships to gender and gender expression. As we know, Sendak's own coming of age was dually marginal, both connected to his ethnic background and also to his own queerness. I particularly love this image from his yearbook, Lafayette High School in Brooklyn. As a child, he was far from your typical boy. He suffered nicknames like Sissy and was more concerned with storytelling, drawing, and drama than with peers or athletics. And he even recalled a crush on the man who tutored him for his bar mitzvah, who was also a Polish Jewish immigrant like his parents. And he became fully aware of his sexuality by his teenage years, despite the wider world's desire for him to not express it. Coming of age as a gay man during the mid-20th century, when this was far more taboo, criminalized, pathologized, he remained open about his sexual orientation with friends and loved ones throughout most of his adult life, and shared his life with another Jewish-American man, Eugene Glynn, who was a psychiatrist and art critic and partner to Sendak for about half a century. And earlier, around 1948, Sendak was already getting to know a different gay Jewish therapist. This was Dr. Bertram Slaff. He was beginning psychoanalysis with Dr. Slaff, following a period in which he had attempted to live in Hell's Kitchen, which at the time was a place for young working class people. There were a lot of gay youth living there. This was about age 20. He was trying to live independently as a young gay man in Hell's Kitchen, but this period ended in emotional strife and moving back in with his parents in Brooklyn. Sendak might have been attracted to Dr. Slaff, his therapist's clinical focus on the emotional plight of gifted youth specifically. Slaff wrote about those whose creative interiority isolated them from the wider society, and argued that creative personalities and gifted individuals are sometimes pathologized unjustly as having character disorders. And it's really processing his inner world with Dr. Slaff in the late 40s, early 50s, that Sendak himself emerges as an artist, really finds his voice. One example, so the vision that would inspire Where the Wild Things Are, he recalled emerged in therapy with Dr. Slaff. It was a vision of a small child or creature that was yearning to break free from an enclosure, to seek freedom and vitality. And I think we can understand an image like that, and his first version, this dummy version of Where the Wild Things Are, begins as Where the Wild Horses Are. He has it as a child running after these horses, breaking out of a small enclosure. I think we can understand an image like that as relating both to the desire to perhaps come out of his shell as a gay person in a world that perhaps didn't encourage this, but also I think it relates to an earlier story I mentioned, the nightmares he had as a child of his mother being pushed into a cellar as Cossacks raided her mother's grocery store. Right? So the terror and the pain of being trapped inside when danger is outside, right? Whether that danger relates to one's own personal orientation or to prejudice in the world, connected to Jewishness, queerness, what have you. After developing this idea a little bit further, right, Where the Wild Horses Are never became a book. But first, he publishes Kenny's Window before Where the Wild Things Are. And this is a book about a timid boy whose dreams take him beyond the confines of his bedroom. I think it draws a lot from Sendak's experience as a sickly child who was often made to stay indoors, his father telling him stories. And Sendak would eventually write the text for Where the Wild Things Are after Kenny's Window while vacationing on Fire Island, which was an area... Oh, I'm sorry. Getting ahead of myself. So he wrote the text on Fire Island, of course, an area known for its gay population and in some areas for its Jewish community as well. I believe it was in the 1950s that the first Torah scroll was brought to Fire Island for one of its communities there, an Orthodox community. And it's there that, again, this text comes to him, and he writes it in a kind of feverish way as a rhythm moving to a quick pace, really expressing that desire to break free. But even earlier than this, it's already at the beginning of his treatment with Dr. Slaff in the late 1940s, early 1950s, while exploring his own childhood and analysis, that he begins to notice the figures that will inspire his artistic career more broadly, children, and specifically the children who are playing on his parents' block in Brooklyn, Jewish and Sicilian children of the neighborhood there. Again, I mentioned he had moved back into Brooklyn, his parents' home in Brooklyn, after kind of failing to take off independently in Hell's Kitchen. So by the late 1940s, he's back in Brooklyn, he's living with his parents, he's going into treatment, and he's noticing these children and sketching them in the neighborhood from his window. He started a sketchbook to record their quirky antics, and these sketches would become the basis for some of his earliest picture books a few years later in the early 50s. And so why was he noticing children? Why did he find particular interest in them? I argue, and he's argued in his writing, that their creativity as socially uninitiated, sensitive beings, improvisational human beings, spoke to something that he experienced, which was the need to use fantasy play to find strategic pathways for surviving a life not experienced fully as one's own. Because as we know, I think children are regularly asked to surrender themselves to powerful others' emotional needs in order to secure the care required for survival. Children at times disappear emotionally while remaining present in the performances expected of them to secure that survival, to secure that protection from the adults in their lives. Children are experts at play, at emptying their consciousness to become whatever role that they're enacting. And they exhibit the powers of comic book superheroes who traverse time and space and move between fantasy and reality in ways that most adults no longer remember how to do. I think it's the famous Picasso adage that all children are artists. It's only some adults that remember how to be artists, right? Later on, something along those lines. And as a side note, Sendak's first high school after-school job was in the comics industry. So this idea of these fantasy figures who move between reality and fantasy, right, is something that he likely would have been thinking about. And I think some of his artwork, we'll see some images from In the Night Kitchen later, for example, reflect the comic book style. When Sendak first encountered Ursula Nordstrom, the editor at Harper for children's books, who would champion his career in the early days, he himself appeared somewhat childlike to her. She asked, "How old are you?" He was so withdrawn and quiet at the time. He was working at FAO Schwartz as a kind of window decorator. But still, the following day, after studying his sketchbook of these Jewish and Sicilian children from the neighborhood of his parents in Brooklyn, she hired him to illustrate Marcel Aimé's The Wonderful Farm in 1951, and from there his career took off so much that the following year he is back in Manhattan, living there full-time by 1952. And challenging picture book conventions, these early illustrations of his, for example, his illustrations of Ruth Krauss's A Hole is to Dig, another Jewish writer, featured unruly, ethnically marginal children, urban kids who are defying the normative Anglo ideals of childhood innocence, sweetness, obedience, blondness, restraint. And visually, he's basing these protagonists again on those same Jewish and Sicilian children from his parents' neighborhood, whom he described as both freewheeling and world-weary creatures with awkward proportions. And commenting on those drawings he shared, and his words are a little bit harsh, these are his words, not mine, they're all a kind of caricature of me. They look as if they've been hit on the head, and hit so hard that they were not going to grow up anymore. These Brooklyn kids were old before their time, most of them Jewish, like little greenhorns just off the boat. They had a kind of bowed look, as if the burdens of the world were on their shoulders. He didn't mean for these children to look like elderly, nervous people, the way that some critics viewed them at the time. He was simply drawing Brooklyn kids the way he remembered them, his own peers, and the way he was observing them. And he described them as kind of contrasting those children in the popular picture books of the time, blonde children from what he called other neighborhoods and other planets. His early depictions of Brooklyn children also avoid traditional gender norms, I argue. So instead, he was celebrating children's uninhibited expressivity despite gender binary norms, including girlhood ambition and boyhood tenderness and sensitivity. And you can see here, for example, the bottom left, right, a girl confidently leading a procession in A Hole is to Dig, a boy washing dishes in an apron tied with a bow, ambiguously gendered children wearing mustaches and different costumes. And he also visualized some moments of same-sex affection, which were previously absent in American children's books, especially between boys. During the 1950s, he's also beginning to do work that reflects some of the folk traditions and differences that he experienced in his own family vis-a-vis the wider American culture. So, for example, with his brother Jack, his older brother Jack, with whom he was very close, he created a book called Happy Rain in 1956. So Jack wrote the book, and a 28-year-old Maurice illustrated it. And in this book, children are growing up in the fictional village of Troken, in which it's the norm for the skies to pour out rain that muddies the streets. And there's some, I think, tropes that reflect Yiddish children's literature. You might know Yingel Zwingel Kvat, some of you, where there's also kind of a change in the weather and kind of magical realism brought about to change or alter the weather. In this book, when the rain suddenly ceases and the sun comes out to shine, the villagers weep and wail and fear that the world is ending. And they follow a bunch of ill-advised sages who offer different suggestions of how to bring the rain back. And nothing works until a young sibling pair, Raymond and Yolanda, consider the cloud's feelings and send them a note. And suddenly the situation is fixed. Raymond is depicted as peering out his window with Yolanda huddled on the bed by his side. And this close sibling pair shares not only a bedroom, but also a secret imaginary world. much like the Sendak siblings themselves, who banded together to devise creative ways to cheer up their grieving parents during the Depression and World War II. So they often created plays and stories. Some of Sendak's first books were actually as a young child, pasting together from newspapers and various sources with his siblings to cheer up his parents. The final illustration of Happy Rain depicts a rain-soaked group of villagers in a joyous hora. You see their feet kicking in a grapevine, with Raymond and Yolanda, the child heroes in the center, leaning their heads against each other. And they find solace and comfort in each other amidst a family and community that feels uneasy about sunny optimism and prefers heavy emotive rain, possibly a stand-in for the tone of Jewish Brooklyn of the 1930s and 1940s, again, in relationship to a wider culture pressuring optimism, pressuring assimilation, pressuring cheerfulness about the new future, rebuilding the nation after the war. In Circus Girl, 1957, another work written by Jack and illustrated by Maurice, we have Flora, a protagonist who's a social outsider who ventures away from the circus in which she was born, another atypical child. Flora tightropes across a suburban neighborhood to spy on normal people in it. And in one image, we see her standing outside looking into a warm domestic dinner scene, casting an elongated shadow against this white house. And children inside the scene are playing with pets as adults prepare a warm meal. Flora stands as a kind of balletic loner in contrast to the relaxed child inside. You see her feet parted in fourth position, a bow tied on her waist and a band on her head. She's a child poised to work in order to belong. And unlike the children in All of a Kind Family by Sidney Taylor, Flora and other children depicted by Sendak in his early work were not seamlessly really fitting into the wider surroundings of their lives. Instead, they traverse divergent cultural spaces and contemplate questions of authenticity, belonging, and the fluidity of self. Skipping ahead a little bit, this might be familiar to some of you. In 1962, he would illustrate a project that, as he once shared, was the project to make his parents the most proud of him in his entire career. And this was Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish-American writer's Zlata the Goat story collection. Upon the book's publication, Sendak cried with his parents as together they sat and identified the relatives that he drew in these stories, drawn directly from the photographs of relatives killed in Poland. He chose to draw these murdered relatives from both sides of the family in a realistic style to revive them for his parents. The careful, intricate cross-hatching of these illustrations offers a fuzzy softness that gives a dreamy kind of humming feeling, I think, that dissolves at its seams. We feel this relationship to memory, this fading memory. And Zlata delivered Yiddish folklore to mainstream American readers in a way that Sendak argued would give everyone something that they could appreciate within Jewish culture, within Yiddish literature. In this project, his creativity functioned not only to work through difficult feelings of his own. A lot of his work he describes as exercising, with an O, exercising difficult emotions he was experiencing. But here he's also providing a living memorial to the loved ones and lost worlds to his parents experienced. Several years later, and I mentioned I would show some artwork from In the Night Kitchen, a comic showing his comic book style. In 1969 to 1970, Sendak's finalizing the artwork for In the Night Kitchen, and this would attend more directly to his own experience, less to his parents' losses and more to his own experience of vicarious endangerment or feelings of vicarious endangerment as a young person learning about relatives being cooked in ovens or killed in the Holocaust. But from the safety of a Brooklyn childhood, a playful Brooklyn childhood, with its accompanying attractions of youth culture and cartoons and Mickey Mouse. Created in his Greenwich Village apartment, a few blocks from the Stonewall riots as they were occurring. And as a side note, this is also when his father Philip is dying and he's getting those Yiddish stories that he's dictating to him. Sendak is kind of straddling these two worlds, right, of his own queerness, the Stonewall riots breaking out a couple blocks away, his father dying, the Yiddish stories that he wants to share with him and remember and record. This is what he produces that year. And the book's depiction of a frontally nude boy who wades through milk and dough, which, as I've suggested, also has some Holocaust connotations, really upset a lot of librarians, right? So it leads to censorship and banning of night kitchens since its initial release. That continues in some contexts. And his editor, Ursula Nordstrom, would gather 500 signatures of professors and various cultural critics to really argue against defaming the book in this way, its artistic integrity, which Sendak saw as a story that required a nude protagonist because it's a story about tasting one's powers for the first time and coming into oneself as a sensory being, and really the different sensory experiences associated with childhood in relationship to the adult world. Right, what happens when the adults go to sleep? Let's skip ahead. During the final decades of the 20th century, he would continue to confront the traumas that plagued his family during his adolescence. For example, when planning the illustrations for Dear Mili, a long-lost Grimm fairy tale, the artist envisioned a Holocaust story explicitly that would feature Anne Frank and scenes of children marched to Auschwitz. He drew this group of children on screen crossing a shaky bridge with a guard tower looming behind them. You can't see it in this illustration, but some wear yellow stars, and some of the branches on the ground are made to look like piles of skeletal corpses. The book also depicts Anne Frank together with children of the French town of Izieu who were murdered under Klaus Barbie at the end of World War II. And together, this group of children forms a choir in heaven led by Mozart, who was one of Sendak's kind of great inspirations and cultural heroes. Like some descriptions of trauma as an experience of a double existence, a split self that enables the survivor to ward off traumatic brushes with death, this is something that Charlotte Delbo has written about. Dear Mili also follows a child who is split, who is hiding alone in the forest and suddenly followed by a doppelganger, a kind of other self, a guardian angel, who eventually claims her for heaven. And the implication is likely that this child passes away in the forest after being separated from her mother. And in the original version, you can see in the 1984 storyboard for the book that the girl looks a little bit more like Anne Frank with the cropped, short, dark hair. Sendak would muse that Anne Frank would have been about his age if she had survived. He turned 61 the year of the book's publication, and he noted that he achieved his own literary success in part to share it vicariously with her. She had always wanted to be a writer. And part of what I'm arguing in the book is that a strange synergy existed for him in his work between his perception of those Jewish children like Anne Frank and like his cousins in Poland, whose lives were forcibly cut short, and then on the other hand, marginalized, emotionally displaced queer subjects like himself who wished to grow up, who wished to feel safe in the world, but found it difficult in a society that ignored, misunderstood, or endangered them. And so in books like We're All in the Dumps with Jack and Guy, for example, we see characters like Jack and Guy who are part of a group of unhoused children made to live outside in dangerous urban conditions and finding themselves facing a smokestack suggestive of Auschwitz. You can see that in the top right image there. At the same time, he's making explicit references to the AIDS crisis. Right? This is the early 90s. Which left so many socially abandoned, so many homeless, unhoused. And Jack and Guy themselves in the story, these children, appear to be a kind of couple themselves, and maybe a queer Jewish couple, buying challah bread, banding together, adopting a younger child who was previously kidnapped. You can also see the maternal moon that he represented as his mother, the head that would stick out of the tenements or the homes in Brooklyn, where she would look out on the block to make sure he was safe, playing outside, looking after him, intervening. During these years, Sendak needed something to uplift his spirits, right? This was a very difficult project to work on, and he collaborated with Tony Kushner on something that was not quite as so lighthearted, but a more theatrical piece based on the 1939 opera Brundibar by Hans Krasse that was performed over 50 times by children imprisoned in Theresienstadt. Sendak worked with Kushner also on a picture book version of the opera in 2003. And for visual research, he borrowed the original watercolor of the stage design that was used in the camp from 1943. You see on screen. Thank you, Justin Cami, if you're watching, for providing that. Like the original set design, Sendak's crayon and watercolor rendition are rich in reds and yellows and rickety textures and brick, wooden planks. And against this visual background of a subtext of poverty and disease and cruel competition, the children in this story, in his rendition, transform themselves into grizzly bears and converse with talking cats and sparrows. They grow sideways, to use Catherine von Stockton's term, into the wild realm of animals and band tightly together to survive a dangerous social reality. This is a different kind of wild things experience. And they represent a variety of physiognomies, some of them also explicitly branded with yellow stars, marked as Jewish and endangered. And they reflect the historical fact that most Theresienstadt child performers of Brundibar were deported to their deaths by the Nazis. Sendak ends this book with a warning about the perennial nature of hatred, that even seemingly defeated villains tend to return in one way or another. And in one earlier image in the book, darkened images of weeping mothers appear beneath giant blackbirds who carry their children away into the night sky. Again, this theme of parent-child separation and of children who are not able to be fully protected by their parents. Sendak would find ultimately a more playful and uplifting work around the same time as Brundibar in the Shirim Klezmer Orchestra's project Pinkus and the Pig, which was run by Glenn Dixon. And this was a klezmer version of Sergei Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf. And while writing the script, he made Peter into Pinkus, which was his father's Yiddish name. And the wolf also he changed to Chazar, which is pig, and also an epithet that Sendak's aunt would use to refer to anti-Semites in Poland. His script for the piece delights in Yiddish-inflected banter between a bird and a duck that you see on screen. In the cover art, the bird wears a yarmulke, and the duck wears a black hat and sidelocks. And he even offered his own voice for narration in this piece. I think it's still available on CD. It's a lot of fun. And he infused it with the language and tone and embodied cadences of his original Wild Things, his Polish refugee relatives. And I'll play you just a quick sentence or two for you to get a sense of his flavor that he offered.
On the branch of a big old tree, a little birdie sat kvetching away. Oi, vey, oi, Gott in Himmel, the gate is open. Is Pinkus looking to get killed again? Surely Chazar, that devil pig, and his gang of schmutzige, vile Schwein will patch poor Pinkus into chopped liver.
So I think it's an important reminder that though I focused a lot on the more morose and complicated and maybe tortured aspects of his subjectivity, that he also had an immense sense of humor, a dark sense of humor, and a lot of fun in the work that he did. And while working on Brundibar and wading through its heaviness, he also enjoyed the opportunity to offer a playful story set in the world of his parents' roots. Again, this kind of transmemory impulse. That offered a tangible triumph of the child protagonist, with Chazar, the evil predator, caught and sent to the unkosher butcher by the end. So I know I'm over time, so I'm going to start wrapping up real quick now before we get to Q&A. And just to kind of recap that this talk, at least I hope, has argued that Sendak's work transformed and universalized a marginalized, embodied experience balanced between, on the one hand, queer difference and Jewish culture and memory, and on the other hand, broader expectations of generic acculturation and normative social trajectories that targeted the symbolic space of childhood. And sensitive to outer threats from infancy and emotionally displaced from the despair of wartime losses, during a widespread era of acculturation, he found himself identifying with young children as models of tightroping across disparate worlds. Right, this playfulness and improvisation of the socially uninitiated creative visionary, the child, the artist. And as he struggled to actualize his adult life and career in the 40s and 50s, the marginal space of children's literature appealed to him, as he described it, as a place to be creative in hiding. He sought to resolve his own internal conflicts, exploring how children manage to comprehend and survive exclusion and danger. And in his work, peculiar and sensitive children balance across these limbo realms situated between their ethnically othered family members and inaccessible but also inescapable forms of memory, as well as a society that imposes demands of assimilation on minority subjects without always meeting them where they are. Inspired by a psychological exploration of his own emotional world as a young person, He challenged the notion that children comprise a singular generic category of raw matter for adult shaping, a notion that itself carried exclusionary cultural incentives. And he would insist that regardless of their age, children are in fact diverse human agents who embody transnational histories and complex orientations that comprise the seeds of a vibrant, evolving future beyond the limits of established conventions in the here and now. And through his depictions of irreverent, wild, culturally unusual children, he pointed to counterintuitive social virtues that can accompany seemingly negative or strange bodies and affects, suggesting that the social other can make for an ideal teacher in matters of resilience, survival strategies, and the importance of metaphor and fantasy for survival. And in this regard, I think my project on Sendak is also a study of how a social category like childhood can operate as a site of cultural negotiation, right? To negotiate the realities of memory, political dynamics, and lived embodiments within the present. So with that, I want to thank you for being a great audience, and hopefully we still have time for a couple of questions. Thank you.
Golan, thank you so much. We will be respectful of your time as well. I know you guys have to get home tonight, so there's a flight ahead of you. But if there's a couple of questions in the room, we'd love to take those. Does anybody have a question about the ideas, the themes, the stories opened up in Golan's work? Nope, fully clear. Everybody understands everything. David? Great.
It might be too big a question. Could you expand on the overlap between trauma theory and queer theory and how that gets transmuted into artistic representation? I mean, he sort of said it at the end, but like children need to grow sideways, but the overlap of survival, maybe, or it's too. And if it's too big a question, then I'll email you. But
no, I think that's great. So there's a concept that Miranda Fricker calls hermeneutical marginalization, or something along those lines. Hermeneutical, in this idea of being excluded from systems of meaning making within the culture that you exist. And I think this speaks to the way that Sendak talked about his impulses as an artist, which came from the need to do something with the intense feelings that lived within him, specifically feelings connected to the pain of childhood, and to make them concrete somehow, to make them speak to each other. And so thinking about trauma theory and queer theory, both address the problems of the subject or the figure who struggles to be, simply to exist. And I think specifically to exist against norms of time, norms of embodied norms, what it means to be a body in space and time. And so while trauma theory is concerned with, for example, how subjects repiece together chronologies of a time that is too difficult to have cognitively processed fully, queer theory is interested in how subjects who are made to experience their futures and their lives along the timelines and narratives that are associated with normality that don't always relate to them. Think reproduction, marriage, etc., the schedules and timelines that certain bodies are expected to undergo that might not reflect the truth of one's inner queer experience. Both relate to concepts like time, body, in unusual ways, the traumatized subject and the queer subject. And so for those like Sendak who grew up in a kind of fog, in a kind of emotional fog, I skipped my adolescence, right? What comes of that fog are sometimes these incoherent, really strong feelings and a need to make sense of them and understand them without a framework that is very applicable, that feels very applicable to understand those feelings. And so in the context of his art, he's often responding to a strong feeling of, whether it's terror or anxiety around separation from his parents, but overwhelm in relationship to his parents and relatives, just to give those two examples, and kind of reconfiguring them in his own queerly and kind of post-traumatic reorganized world that doesn't always make logical, coherent sense, but in a kind of queer, post-traumatic logic, does create its own structure, narratively, aesthetically. So, for example, Outside Over There, the book from 1981 I had on screen of the figure Ida floating backwards, he described it as a story about the reversal of his own life. And in that story, an older sister flies backward through the night to over there, which is also a term that was sometimes used to refer to Holocaust-era Europe. There, they're from there, they're from over there, the unspeakable, there. And what we have is a female infant who's been kidnapped that Sendak's associating himself with, this kind of queerly gendered, for a male author figure, who's being rescued by his sister, who flies backward in time to find the infant in a cave, a kind of womb-like cave, with goblins dancing around it, and the kind of sitting in a cracked eggshell. He's going back to imagine, what if I was able to sort of reverse time and reorganize my relationship to the world, to things like reproduction, et cetera. There's a lot of very phallic and womb-like imagery in that story. And he actually, in his notes, writes to himself, based the sunset in the story on a Fire Island sunset. And he's dealing with all of these elements, right, of his queerness, of his relationship to a post-traumatic familial past, the disorganization internally that he experiences, and reworking those feelings, giving a structure to those feelings in an artistic work. I don't know if that was an eloquent response, but hopefully it gives you a bit of a sense of, I think, how I read these in relationship to each other in his aesthetic project. And I hope you read the book, and it's much more eloquently articulated there.
And on that note, we hope that you all read the book. It is Wild Visionary. And if you'd like to come back here for a book club, just let us know. I misspoke at the beginning of the program. Our next program is next Thursday, the 13th, with Evan Wolfson, with a happy hour that begins before the program. I hope you'll all come back, and happy Pride. Golan, thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy Pride. Thank you.